When one asks how humanity can continue to find Christ, the question must be placed not merely before the intellect, but before the whole being of the human soul. For the Christ is not an object of abstract belief, nor a memory preserved in historical recollection alone. He is a living spiritual reality who accompanies the evolution of human consciousness and reveals himself differently according to the stage of the soul's development. To understand this, one must first grasp that humanity itself is undergoing a profound metamorphosis, particularly since the threshold of the modern age. The manner in which earlier epochs experienced the divine can no longer suffice for the consciousness of the present, and yet the danger lies precisely in losing Christ altogether by clinging to forms that have outlived their inner power. In earlier times, the human being was still naturally embedded in a spiritual world. The divine was experienced as something given, something that flowed into the soul through inherited religious forms, through blood ties, tradition, and communal consciousness. Christ entered history at a moment when this natural clairvoyance was already waning, and his earthly life stood at the turning point between an old, instinctive spiritual perception and a future, fully conscious spiritual knowing. What took place in the mystery of Golgotha was not merely a historical event, but a deed that united the destiny of the earth with the destiny of the human eye. From that moment onward, the possibility was given for the human being to find the divine not outside, but within, through inner development and freedom. Yet this possibility unfolds only gradually. Humanity has passed through centuries in which the Christ impulse was largely mediated through outer institutions, dogmas, and authoritative belief. These were necessary stages, for the human soul first had to be protected while the forces of intellectuality and self-consciousness were awakening. But in our time, these same forms increasingly appear empty to many souls. The danger of modern materialism does not lie merely in denial of spirit, but in the fact that it deprives the human being of any living path toward Christ. When Christ is reduced either to a moral teacher of the past or to an abstract theological concept, the soul can no longer encounter him as a present reality. To continue to find Christ today, humanity must therefore learn to experience him in a new way, through the awakening of inner perception, moral imagination, and conscious spiritual activity. This does not mean a return to old clairvoyance, nor a rejection of clear thinking, but rather the permeation of thinking itself with life, warmth, and devotion to truth. The Christ of the present age approaches the human being not through inherited belief, but through freely won insight, through an inner struggle for honesty, courage, and responsibility. He reveals himself where thinking becomes selfless, where feeling becomes truthful, and where willing becomes morally creative. A decisive element in this renewed Christ experience is the recognition of the polarity between the Ahrimanic and Luciferic forces that increasingly shape modern life. The human being stands between these two tendencies. On the one side, the hardening of consciousness into mere calculation, mechanism, and external control. On the other, the temptation to dissolve into vague spirituality, fantasy, and egotistical exaltation. Christ can be found only in the living equilibrium between these extremes. He is neither the cold abstraction of a mechanized worldview, nor the intoxicating dream of ungrounded mysticism. He is the force that brings clarity without lifelessness, warmth without illusion, and freedom without arbitrariness. In this sense, Finding Christ today is inseparable from developing a new form of responsibility for one's own soul life. The human being can no longer rely on external authorities to carry the Christ impulse. Each individual must become a conscious bearer of it. This requires inner schooling, learning to observe one's thinking, purify one's motives, and transform one's emotions. Where a person begins to experience how selfish impulses can be overcome by conscious love, how untruth can be met with inner courage, and how suffering can be transformed into insight, there Christ is not merely remembered, but encountered as a living power. The future of Christianity does not lie in its preservation as a cultural inheritance, but in its continual rebirth within the human soul. Just as the physical birth of Christ once took place in humility and obscurity, so must his birth in the modern soul occur quietly, often unnoticed by the outer world. Yet this inner Christmas is no less real. It is the moment when the human being senses that the I is not isolated, not abandoned to a meaningless universe, but inwardly connected with a cosmic being who shares the destiny of humanity. To find Christ in the future means to recognize him as the companion of human freedom, the guardian of moral individuality, and the spiritual heart of Earth evolution. If humanity is to continue finding Christ, it must first understand that the Christ impulse has not remained fixed in the form it once assumed in historical Christianity. Steiner emphasizes that Christ did not merely live once in a physical body, he entered into the etheric life of the earth itself. From that moment onward, the earth became permeated with a new spiritual reality, and the human soul gained the possibility of encountering Christ not only through memory or tradition, but through direct inner experience. This shift, however, demands a corresponding transformation of human consciousness. In the modern age, the human being is increasingly called to awaken in thinking. Yet thinking, when left to itself, tends toward abstraction, coldness, and separation from life. Steiner points out that this development is necessary, but dangerous if not balanced. For Christ can no longer be found through instinctive feeling or inherited belief alone. He must be sought within thinking itself. This requires that thinking be transformed from a mere instrument of analysis into a living organ of perception. When thinking becomes inwardly active, disciplined, and free of egoistic desire, it can begin to perceive spiritual reality. In such thinking, Christ becomes accessible as a living presence. This new Christ experience does not reveal itself through visions or emotional exaltation, but through a deepening of moral awareness. Steiner repeatedly stresses that Christ is most truly encountered where the human being learns to act out of conscience rather than impulse, out of love rather than fear. In this sense, moral development is not secondary to spiritual knowledge. It is its foundation. The Christ impulse strengthens the human capacity to act freely for the sake of the good, without external compulsion. Wherever a person experiences the quiet authority of conscience arising from within, there Christ is at work. At the same time, humanity must learn to recognize the spiritual challenges that accompany this path. The modern soul is increasingly exposed to forces that seek to divert it from genuine spiritual experience. One such force hardens thinking into mere technical intelligence, cutting it off from life and meaning. Another seduces the soul into subjective spirituality, where personal feelings replace truth. Steiner describes Christ as the being who leads the human soul through this narrow path between hardening and dissolution. To find Christ today means to endure this tension consciously without fleeing into either extreme. Steiner also points to the significance of the etheric Christ event, which marks a decisive stage in humanity's ability to perceive Christ inwardly. As human consciousness becomes capable of etheric perception, Christ can be experienced as a reality active in the life forces of the earth and the human being. This perception does not depend on extraordinary psychic gifts, but on the moral and cognitive maturation of the soul. The etheric Christ does not appear to the senses, but to a consciousness that has learned to unite clarity of thought with reverence and humility. Finding Christ in this way is inseparable from responsibility for the world. Steiner emphasizes that the Christ impulse works not only in individual salvation, but in the healing of social life. Wherever human beings strive to meet one another as free individuals, not as functions or abstractions, Christ becomes present between them. This is particularly important in an age in which social structures increasingly threaten to reduce the human being to a number, a role, or a mechanism. To find Christ today means to resist this dehumanization through conscious acts of recognition and love. Thus, the continuation of the Christ path is bound to the evolution of human freedom. Christ does not compel belief, nor does he impose himself upon the soul. He waits to be found. The more humanity develops self-consciousness, the more hidden Christ appears to become. Yet this hiddenness is not absence. It is an invitation. It calls the human being to seek Christ not in outer signs, but in the depths of moral striving and awakened thinking. Only in this way can the Christ impulse continue to live in a world that no longer supports it instinctively. As humanity moves further into an age of self-awareness and individual responsibility, the question of finding Christ becomes inseparable from the experience of inner solitude. Steiner emphasizes that modern souls increasingly encounter moments in which inherited faith, collective forms, and external assurances fall away. What remains is often a sense of emptiness or uncertainty. Yet this apparent absence is not a loss in the true sense. It is the necessary space in which a free encounter with Christ can arise. The soul must first experience itself as alone in order to discover a relationship that is freely chosen rather than unconsciously inherited. In this solitude, the human being confronts the full weight of freedom. Without outer authority to lean upon, each individual must learn to distinguish truth from illusion within their own soul. Steiner stresses that this task cannot be accomplished through intellect alone. The intellect can analyze, compare, and critique, but it cannot generate meaning. To find Christ in this inner desert, thinking must be permeated by moral seriousness and devotion to truth. Where thinking becomes honest, patient, and self-critical, it opens itself to a higher guidance that is not imposed, but recognized. This inner struggle is closely connected with suffering. Steiner does not shy away from this fact. He speaks of suffering as a threshold experience, one that can either embitter the soul or deepen it. When suffering is met with resistance, denial, or resentment, it hardens the soul and closes it off from spiritual reality. When it is met with conscious reflection and openness, it becomes a means of transformation. In such moments, Christ is not found as comfort alone, but as strength. The strength to remain inwardly upright even when outer supports collapse. Steiner also emphasizes that the modern path to Christ requires a new relationship to evil. Evil is no longer something that can be attributed solely to external forces or personal weakness. It appears increasingly as a structural element of modern life, embedded in systems, habits, and modes of thinking. To find Christ today means to recognize evil without fear and to confront it without hatred. Christ does not overcome evil by suppressing it, but by transforming it through consciousness and love. This transformation begins within the individual soul. Another essential aspect of finding Christ in the present age lies in the development of imagination, inspiration, and intuition, not as vague psychic faculties, but as moral capacities. Steiner speaks of moral imagination as the ability to envision concrete actions that serve the good in specific situations. This capacity does not arise from rules, but from an inner attunement to spiritual reality. Where a person begins to act creatively out of moral insight, Christ becomes present in human deeds. In this way, Christ is no longer sought only in inner experience, but is realized through action in the world. The social dimension of this path becomes increasingly important. Steiner points out that Christ can be found not only within the individual, but in the space between human beings. Wherever genuine understanding, forgiveness, and mutual recognition arise, a spiritual reality enters social life. This reality cannot be institutionalized or enforced. It must be continually renewed through conscious effort. In an age of polarization and fragmentation, the ability to meet the other as a free human being becomes a profound spiritual practice. Thus, finding Christ today involves a transformation of how the human being relates to self, to suffering, to evil, and to others. It is no longer a matter of belonging to a tradition, but of becoming a bearer of the Christ impulse through inner work. The soul learns to carry responsibility without guarantees, to love without possession, and to seek truth without external reward. In this way, Christ becomes not an object of belief, but a living companion on the path of freedom. When we look toward the future of humanity, Steiner makes it clear that the question of finding Christ will become ever more inward and ever more demanding. The Christ impulse will no longer be supported by external culture in the way it once was. Religious language, symbols, and institutions will continue to lose their binding force. This does not mean that Christ withdraws from humanity. Rather, humanity is being asked to meet Christ on a new level, one that corresponds to the maturity of the consciousness soul. The future Christ experience will be quiet, inward, and deeply personal, yet at the same time universally human. Steiner emphasizes that Christ can be found wherever the human being learns to unite clear thinking with warmth of heart and moral courage. In a world increasingly dominated by abstraction, calculation, and external control, this unity becomes a spiritual task of the highest importance. Thinking must become truthful without becoming cold. Feeling must become compassionate without becoming blind. Willing must become resolute without becoming destructive. Christ lives in this balance. He is present where human faculties are harmonized rather than set against one another. This path requires patience. Steiner repeatedly stresses that spiritual realities cannot be grasped through haste or demand. The modern soul often seeks immediate experience, certainty, or emotional confirmation. Yet, The Christ of the present and future age does not reveal himself to such demands. He reveals himself where the soul learns to endure not knowing, to remain faithful to truth even when it offers no comfort, and to act morally without recognition. In this endurance, the soul gradually becomes capable of perceiving a spiritual presence that does not overwhelm, but strengthens freedom. Another decisive aspect of finding Christ in the future lies in the conscious transformation of thinking itself. Steiner describes how thinking can become a bridge between the human and the divine when it is freed from personal ambition and guided by devotion to reality. Such thinking does not dominate the world, it listens to it. When thinking becomes receptive rather than grasping, it opens itself to inspiration. In this state, Christ can be experienced as the living Word working within human consciousness, not as doctrine, but as guidance. Steiner also points toward the moral future of humanity. The Christ impulse works wherever human beings take responsibility not only for their own development, but for the evolution of the earth as a whole, caring for human dignity, protecting life, and resisting forces that dehumanize or mechanize existence are not merely ethical concerns, they are spiritual acts. Through such acts, Christ becomes active in the world. Humanity finds Christ, not by withdrawing from earthly life, but by transforming it. Ultimately, Steiner's answer to the question of how humanity can continue to find Christ lies in freedom. Christ does not compel belief, nor does he reveal himself through power. He waits to be recognized by souls who have learned to stand upright within themselves. The more humanity develops independence, the more difficult this recognition becomes, and the more meaningful it is when it occurs. Christ becomes the being who walks with the human eye, not above it, not outside it, but within it, striving toward truth and love. Thus, the future of the Christ impulse depends on whether human beings are willing to undertake the inner work required by freedom. Where this work is avoided, Christ appears absent. Where it is taken up with sincerity and courage, Christ is found anew, not as a relic of the past, but as a living presence guiding humanity toward a more conscious, humane, and spiritually grounded future.